Let's now take functions even one step further and calling one function from inside another function. And this is something that we do all the time in JavaScript, but I have seen many beginners struggle to understand this logic. And so I created a specific video just for this topic. And to illustrate functions calling other functions, let's go back to our initial example of a function being like a food processor. So let's move to the first functions lecture, which is this one, and simply copy this function. So remember that we had this function, which was like a fruit processor, which received a certain number of apples and a certain number of oranges, and then based on that, it basically produced and returned a juice to us. But now in this example, let's consider that the fruit processor can only make juice with smaller fruit pieces. And so before making the juice, the food processor now needs another machine that first cuts the fruits that we give it into multiple smaller pieces. So I hope that's not an example too silly, but I think it makes sense actually to understand the point that I'm trying to make. So let's actually start by writing that machine. So basically that function that cuts a fruit into multiple pieces. So let's say function cut fruit pieces, and then this function will receive a fruit. And all this function will do is to return the fruit cut in 4 pieces. So basically, fruit multiplied by 4. So if we get 2 apples here, it will return 8 pieces to us. So simply the number 8. Okay, so that's our machine that cuts the fruit in pieces. And now here in the fruit processor itself, we receive the apples and oranges, and then we're going to use our newly created machine to cut the received apples and oranges into pieces. And so let's do that. So we start by calling cut fruit pieces in here with the number of apples that were received. And the result of calling this function, we will then capture into a variable called apple pieces. Apple pieces. Okay? And now let's do the same for the oranges that we receive. So orange pieces will be also cut fruit pieces, but we call it with the oranges. Okay, and so for the first time now, we called one function inside of another function. So if we now call fruit processor with 2 and 3, then this will call the fruit processor function, which then in turn will call the cut fruit pieces function, and actually twice, so once here and once here. And so let's now actually analyze how the data flows between these functions. So down here we are calling the fruit processor function with the arguments 2 and 3. And as we already know, this will then replace the apples parameter in the function with the number 2 and the oranges parameter in the function with the number 3. So that should be nothing new at this point, right? We are simply replacing the parameter placeholders with the actual values 2 and 3. And now let's analyze what's going to happen with these apple value. So apple right now holds the number 2. And that value 2 will then be used to call the cut pieces function, right? Now, as we call cut pieces, this 2 is actually the argument for the cut pieces function. And it will basically replace the fruit parameter, so the fruit placeholder, okay? So now fruit here in this cut pieces function is also 2. And I hope that these arrows here make the data flow quite obvious. Then inside this function, of course, the fruit is then also 2, which will get multiplied by 4. And so the result here is going to be 8. And so the result of calling this cut pieces function with apples will be 8. And so that's the value that we then store into the apple pieces variable. And from there, we will then build this juice string that we have down here. Okay? So take a moment and analyze exactly how the data flows from one function to another, because I know that it can be a little bit confusing, especially calling the cut pieces function here without a tangible number. So we're calling cut pieces here not with an actual number that we wrote ourselves, like 2 or 3, but really with the argument that we received into fruit processor. So that can be a little bit confusing, so take a second to understand exactly what happens here. And what happened here with the apples variable will of course happen exactly the same with oranges. And so I'm not going to go into that part here, because that would be too confusing having all these arrows here on the slide. But of course you can analyze that for yourself and see exactly what is going to happen. But now let's move back to the code to see how this actually works out in practice. And so now we need to change this juice string here. So in the function that we just saw, it was already complete, but let's now write that out ourselves. So here we used to have apples, but now we want to use the apple pieces value. So apple pieces, piece of apples, and then here we want orange pieces, pieces of orange. So orange and apple here. Okay, so here we call the fruit processor function then, just as I explained in the slide. And then let's simply log the result to the console. There is no need in this case to store it into a variable. Okay, and so again, this works because the result of calling this function will become this string here that we return from the function. And so then console.log works with that string. So let's try that. And indeed, we get a juice with 8 pieces, which is 4 times 2 here, and then 12 pieces of orange, which is 3 times 4. And so that works just as expected. Great. So I think that was a really great example to illustrate this mechanics of one function calling the other. But now again, you might ask the following question. Why not simply multiply both of the input values by 4 and call it a day? So we could do that, of course. We can say apple pieces equals apples times 4, and orange pieces here is oranges times 4 as well. Well, but we did it this way for, well, multiple reasons. First, the point that I'm making here is that it's very common for one function to call another function. So just like we did here. And second, this is also a very good example to illustrate the don't repeat yourself principle that I mentioned earlier. So the dry principle. For example, imagine that suddenly the cutting machine would cut in 3 pieces and not in 4 pieces. Then, if we didn't have the separate cut fruit pieces function, we would have to change the code in multiple places. And this is not a problem, of course, with 2 lines of code. But if we needed to cut like 10 fruits into pieces, then we would have to change that in all the places, and that would simply be annoying, and it could also be a source of bugs, so of coding mistakes. And so it's a lot better to put that functionality into its own function. So if the fruit was now only cut in 3 pieces, all we have to do is to change it here, and that's it. Then this changes to 6, which is 2 times 3, and this changes to 9, which is 3 times 3. Okay? So I hope that made sense to you, and that you can start internalizing this kind of logic. With time and practice, you will exactly know when you should create your own functions and when to have multiple functions, one calling another. Great. Once more, congratulations for all the progress that you're making here. Working through these lectures about functions can be a lot of work, I know, and it can be sometimes a little bit confusing. So you're making great progress, and it's great to see that you're already at this point of the course. So again, functions is a very important topic, and so in the next video, we're going to take a couple of minutes to review the fundamental principles about functions that we just learned here. So stay tuned for that one, and I see you in a minute.